They said the new GM V8 was the most advanced engine ever built by General Motors. Lighter, cleaner, more efficient, the pinnacle of American engineering. But within months of its launch, proud new owners began calling tow trucks on the side of the highway. Engines that were supposed to last for decades were dying before they reached their first oil change. What happened inside America's most trusted automaker is a story that begins with innovation and ends in corporate silence. This is not a story about one broken part. It's a story about a system that broke, from the boardroom to the assembly line. A story of engineers who raised red flags and managers who buried them, of spreadsheets that replaced common sense and cost-cutting that became a philosophy. Behind every failed Silverado or Tahoe engine, there's a chain of decisions made by people who believed they could outsmart physics and get away with it. By the spring of 2022, reports began to leak out of Texas, Michigan, and Ohio. Brand new trucks, some with barely 10 miles on the odometer, were arriving at dealerships on flatbeds. The diagnosis? Bearing failure. Oil starvation, cracked blocks, words that should never be spoken about a brand new V8. GM insisted it was an isolated issue, but inside the company, engineers had already compiled a list of 47 critical incidents. Each one represented an engine that could seize without warning and potentially cause an accident. What no one outside GM knew was that these engines had been walking a tightrope from the very beginning. To meet new fuel economy regulations, the design team pushed the limits of metallurgy, oil viscosity, and thermal efficiency. They thinned the oil passages, lightened the crankshaft, reduced internal friction, and in the process removed the safety margins that made older GM engines legendary. The official oil recommendation, a razor-thin synthetic 0W20, was meant to save fractions of a percent in fuel economy, but under heavy load, it became a liability. Pressure dropped. Metal met metal, and engines that looked perfect on paper were falling apart on the road. Then came the cover-ups. Service bulletins rewritten, internal memos marked "Do not distribute." Dealers told to calm customers with vague promises and temporary fixes. When supplies of replacement engines ran out, GM quietly suggested switching to thicker oil 0W40, but never updated the manuals. It was a desperate move, an admission that something had gone terribly wrong. By the beginning of 2022, General Motors customer service lines were recording an unusual pattern. Calls from owners of the company's flagship V8 engines, the L84 and L87 units used in Silverado, Tahoe, Yukon, and Suburban, were reporting sudden engine stalls, oil pressure drops, and in some cases, complete mechanical seizure. Initially, GM categorized them as isolated incidents. A firmware update was suggested, then a change in supplier for oil filters, but beneath that calm corporate tone, internal engineers were panicking. A confidential report prepared in February 2022 by a GM powertrain specialist, later leaked to several automotive journalists, described the issue as systemic. The memo warned that the new lightweight aluminum block, combined with redesigned oil channels optimized for efficiency, had created a perfect storm of heat and friction. Under sustained load, pressure could collapse in under 30 seconds, starving the crankshaft bearings of lubrication. The report estimated that up to 1 in every 200 engines built between October and December 2021 might already be at risk of catastrophic failure. Inside GM's Warren Technical Center in Michigan, the atmosphere shifted from optimism to quiet dread. Test cells began running engines around the clock. According to one anonymous technician, 3 engines failed within the first 24 hours of continuous testing, each showing the same signature damage. Scored crank journals, discolored rods, and collapsed oil passages near the number 4 bearing. Engineers nicknamed it the choke point. Still, upper management hesitated to act. Production targets for the 2022 model year were the highest in a decade, and the company's marketing campaign had already spent millions branding the engine as the heart of the next generation. To issue a recall before launch would mean halting shipments to dealerships across North America, an unthinkable move in the middle of a global supply shortage. So, in internal meetings, the directive was clear. Monitor, don't announce. But the road had other plans. By March, dealership service departments in Texas, Michigan, and Nevada were overwhelmed. A GM dealer in Houston, who later spoke on condition of anonymity, said they received 7 trucks in 1 week with failed engines, all with fewer than 20 miles on the odometer. One of them, still wearing temporary plates, had seized halfway through its very first test drive. Mechanics began taking photos of the damage, the glittering metallic dust in oil pans, the deep gouges in bearings, and posting them anonymously to forums. The story broke online before GM could control it. An independent YouTube channel called Truck Truth released a video titled "Brand New Silverado Engine Fails at 12 Miles, What GM Won't Tell You." Within days, it reached 2 million views, comment sections filled with similar experiences. GM's PR department scrambled, but the narrative had already escaped them. Officially, GM issued a short statement in April. A limited number of 2022 model vehicles equipped with our 5.3L and 6.2L V8 engines may experience performance irregularities under certain conditions. We are investigating. Unofficially, insiders claimed the list of affected vehicles had grown to nearly 600 nationwide, a number that would quietly double by summer. For decades, General Motors had built its reputation on the promise of reliability, a brand that sold engines as much as vehicles. But now, that very legacy was under attack. The failures weren't isolated anymore. They were the first visible cracks in a system that had pushed too far, chasing fuel economy targets and profit margins at the expense of mechanical resilience. When Robert Dorsey's Silverado was finally returned to him 3 months later, fitted with a replacement engine, a service manager handed him a folded paper and whispered, "Use 0W40, not 0W20, trust me." The note wasn't official. Neither was the problem, at least not yet. But the silence from GM headquarters had already begun to sound like guilt. A team within GM Powertrain, known internally as the Black Oak Group, was tasked with redesigning the next generation of the company's small B8 engines. Their goal was to shave off weight, reduce internal friction, and increase fuel efficiency by at least 10% without compromising performance. But from the start, engineers warned that the targets were unrealistic. One of them, a veteran named Samuel Kruger, allegedly told his supervisor during a 2018 design meeting, "We can't make this lighter without making it weaker." His memo, later leaked to the press, outlined the dangers of thinning oil passages and reducing bearing clearances to save a fraction of a mile per gallon. It was ignored. At the same time, a shift in GM's internal culture was taking place. Many of the old-school mechanical engineers, the kind who insisted on double safety margins and redundant systems, were being replaced by efficiency specialists focused on digital modeling and corporate metrics. Spreadsheets replaced gut instincts. Managers spoke in percentages, not tolerances. The drive for optimization became almost ideological. An engineer later described it as a race to zero. Zero waste, zero drag, zero margin for error. To make matters worse, GM's financial division had tied executive bonuses directly to fleet-wide fuel efficiency targets. Every tenth of a mile per gallon mattered. The thinner oil recommendation, the lightweight crankshaft, the reduced oil pump pressure, all of these decisions were worth points on the corporate scorecard. No one wanted to be the person who slowed the program down by demanding another test cycle or thicker bearings. The culture rewarded compliance, not caution. Behind closed doors, some within GM's testing department began noticing early signs of trouble. A set of engines run in hot weather trials in Arizona showed unexpected bearing wear after just 2,000 miles. The report was classified as inconclusive and archived. Around the same time, a contractor from Delphi, one of GM's longtime suppliers, privately warned that the redesigned oil pump's capacity curve left no room for degradation over time. The warning never reached senior management. By 2020, as the pandemic disrupted global supply chains, GM executives made one final fateful decision: to accelerate the V8 production schedule. Prototype engines that would normally undergo an additional 6 months of endurance testing were approved for mass production after only 8 weeks of validation. The company's testing facilities were running at reduced capacity, but the trucks had to reach showrooms on schedule. A memo from the vice president of manufacturing stated bluntly, "Delays are not an option." On paper, it looked like a triumph of modern efficiency. The new V8s were lighter, more powerful, and significantly cleaner than their predecessors. They met every corporate target and regulatory requirement, but in reality, they were ticking time bombs. Machines engineered on the razor's edge of failure. The lessons that older generations of GM engineers had learned through decades of trial, error, and broken parts had been replaced by digital optimism and corporate deadlines. When the first engines began to fail in 2022, few inside GM were surprised. Some even expected it. They had seen the warnings, the test data, the internal debates, and they knew this day would come. What they didn't know was how far the damage would spread, or how long the company would try to keep it quiet. The crisis that erupted on highways and in repair shops across America was born not from one bad decision, but from 1,000 small ones, each justified, each rationalized, each made in the name of progress. The root cause was not a single design flaw, but a series of interacting weaknesses. The oil pump, redesigned for efficiency, delivered pressure that looked fine in simulations but collapsed in real-world conditions where oil temperature and viscosity fluctuated. The bearing clearances, optimized to minimize drag, were so tight that even the slightest debris or temperature rise could trigger seizure. Internal emails later revealed that a few engineers had quietly recommended slightly wider tolerances, but those proposals were dismissed as unnecessary conservatism. Combined with the paper-thin oil passages and the low-viscosity 0W20 synthetic oil, the system was operating at the edge of mechanical possibility. One engineer would later describe it bitterly. "We built a race engine and told people to tow boats with it." As the failures multiplied, GM's internal response followed a predictable corporate rhythm: contain, deflect, deny. Service departments were instructed to collect failed engines and return them to regional centers for analysis, while replacement units were quietly shipped out. The company did not issue a recall, calling the issue limited and under control. Yet the warehouses in Flint and Arlington were filling up with destroyed engines, rows upon rows of metallic carcasses awaiting disassembly. A confidential report circulated among GM's regional managers estimated that the actual defect rate might exceed 1%, a catastrophic figure in automotive terms. But public acknowledgement of that number would have triggered a mandatory recall under federal guidelines. So it was buried. Dealerships, caught between angry customers and vague corporate memos, found themselves improvising explanations. Some told clients that contaminated fuel was to blame. Others hinted at improper break-in procedures. In Houston, a dealer was recorded telling a frustrated owner that he must have revved the engine too hard. During the first week behind the scenes, technicians whispered that GM had advised them to recommend thicker oil, 0140, despite no official bulletin confirming this. Mechanics began hoarding replacement engines, knowing that supply was dwindling. By late autumn, wait times for warranty replacements stretched to 3 months or more. The tension between GM and its dealers escalated quickly. In November 2022, the North American Dealers Association received a wave of complaints from franchise owners claiming that GM was withholding reimbursements for warranty claims. Some smaller dealerships in rural areas dependent on truck sales were pushed to the brink of bankruptcy. An internal email leaked to the automotive press showed one district manager writing, "Our service bays are full of dead trucks. Customers are furious. We need corporate backup, not silence." That email, published by an independent journalist, ignited a storm on social media. Hashtags like GM-V8 fail and EngineGate began trending, forcing GM to issue a carefully worded public statement acknowledging rare but concerning performance issues. But by then, the damage was spreading faster than GM could contain it. Class section lawsuits were filed in Texas, Michigan, and California, accusing the company of knowingly selling defective engines and misleading customers about their reliability. Law firms claimed to possess internal documents proving that GM's engineering teams had warned executives as early as 2019 about potential bearing failures. Among the most explosive pieces of evidence was an internal slide deck from a 2020 design review labeled "Risk Acknowledged, No Mitigation Path." GM's legal department argued that the document was misinterpreted, but the optics were devastating. The human cost inside the company was harder to quantify but equally real. Engineers who had dedicated their careers to perfecting the small AB architecture watched helplessly as decades of credibility eroded overnight. Some took early retirement, others were reassigned to EV programs. In interviews given under anonymity, several described a culture of denial that had taken hold in GM's upper management. They didn't want to hear about problems, one said. They wanted reassurance that the plan was working. When the failures could no longer be ignored, management shifted blame downward, claiming that testing data had been misinterpreted. Morale at the powertrain division in Pontiac hit an all-time low. For customers, the betrayal felt personal. The GM V8 wasn't just another engine, it was a cultural symbol, a piece of Americana. Owners who had grown up trusting the thunderous reliability of Chevrolet and GMC trucks now faced the humiliation of being stranded by brand new vehicles. Online forums became support groups where mechanics and drivers exchanged oil pressure readings and shared photos of damaged bearings. Videos of engine teardown analyses racked up millions of views. The once unshakable loyalty of GM's truck base began to fracture. As 2024 unfolded, GM finally took steps toward damage control. A technical service update was quietly released, recommending thicker oil and revised maintenance intervals, though the document avoided any admission of fault. Replacement engines were modified with slightly enlarged oil passages and updated pump calibrations. Internally, GM began a full audit of its powertrain testing protocols, bringing back several retired engineers as consultants. But these measures came too late to repair the company's reputation. Sales of Silverado and Tahoe models dropped nearly 35% compared to the previous year, forcing dealerships to offer deep discounts and extended warranties just to move inventory. The lawsuits dragged on through 2024, merging into a massive federal case by the following year. GM's lawyers fought to keep certain internal communications sealed, but leaks continued to emerge. Emails, memos, even photos of cracked cylinder blocks from prototype engines. Each new revelation chipped away at the narrative of an isolated problem. It was now clear that GM's crisis wasn't just mechanical, but moral. The brand that once defined reliability had gambled with its own identity, trading caution for compliance, integrity for expedience. By the time the crisis reached its breaking point, GM's leadership was no longer asking how the engines had failed, but what could possibly save the company from itself. Inside the Renaissance Center headquarters in Detroit, conference rooms turned into war rooms. Whiteboards were filled with damage estimates, timelines, and contingency plans. 3 paths were on the table, each more painful than the last. The first was technical redemption, a complete redesign of the V8 platform. The second, a strategic retreat. Accelerate the company's shift toward hybrid and electric powertrains, abandoning the traditional engine line that had defined GM for nearly 70 years. The third was unthinkable to some executives. Exit the full-size truck market entirely and focus on compact vehicles and EVs. Each choice meant sacrifice, and none guaranteed survival. The engineering proposal was ambitious, a new generation of V8s built with reinforced blocks, improved oil delivery, and adaptive lubrication systems capable of responding to real-time load conditions. The idea was to rebuild trust by proving that GM could still master the art of the internal combustion engine. Early prototypes showed promise, but the estimated cost of redevelopment, nearly $2 billion, made investors uneasy. To make matters worse, supply chains were still strained, and GM's powertrain division was struggling to retain experienced engineers after the public humiliation of the previous years. The technical path offered redemption but required time, and time was the one resource GM didn't have. The alternative plan was to pivot fully toward electrification, branding it as a bold leap into the future. Behind closed doors, executives called it Operation Phoenix. It promised to erase the stigma of the failed V8 by replacing it with sleek electric trucks and hybrid SUVs that would signal a new era of innovation. But internally, many knew it wasn't that simple. The heart of GM's market, rural America, construction companies, long-haul users, wasn't ready to give up on gasoline. Surveys revealed that more than half of loyal Silverado owners said they would never buy an electric truck. The pivot risked alienating the very base that had kept the company alive for decades.